From FlourishDx, this is the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. With workplace mental health becoming a safety prerogative, this is the source of information on psychological injury prevention and health promotion.
Hi, welcome everyone to the latest webinar from FlourishDx, Sexual Harassment Prevention, 2 Duties, 1 Approach. My name is Jason Banshee. I'm the Managing Director of FlourishDx. I'm a psychologist, but I'm not the subject matter expert for today. That would be my colleague, Joelle Mitchell, who I'll get to introduce herself in a moment. With us, we also have a couple of colleagues, Alicia and Andrew from Melbourne and Sydney. This session is really in response to new information out from the Human Rights Commission around how they're going to be enforcing the positive duty under the Sexual Discrimination Act. Joelle is definitely much more of an expert on this area than what I am, so I'm not going to butcher it, but it's going to be an interesting discussion given how it also aligns with what's required under the regulations for psychosocial risk management. Just in terms of how the session is going to run, we've got you for an hour, so we will be aiming to get all the content in about 30 or 40 minutes, and then we will be having a formal Q&A at the end. If you do have any questions, though, that do pop into your mind as we go through, feel free to use the chat and drop them in there. And if we notice them, then we might, and if they're relevant to bring up at that point in time and address, we'll address them as we go. We've got a bit of experience doing that now. Okay, so that's pretty much it in terms of how it's going to run. We, as Joelle put in the chat, we will be distributing the PowerPoint slides following the session as well as the video. We don't always do that, but again, because of the popularity of the session, we will be. But before I get Joelle to introduce herself, I just want to pay my respects to the traditional custodians of the lands that we're on today. Joelle and I are in Perth, so that's the Whadjuk people. And I'd like to pay my respects to their elders past, present, and emerging. But over to Joelle, just a quick introduction, Joelle, and then I'll introduce FlourishDx.
Thanks, Jason. So I'm Joelle Mitchell. I'm an organisational psychologist and I'm the Global Head of Psychological Health and Safety at FlourishDx. My background is in safety and risk management and a little bit in regulation. So, that's why I'm speaking to this topic today.
Yeah, and as she'll talk to, she's done a bit of work recently with one of the regulators in this space as a subject matter expert on the topic. But look, for those of you who are unfamiliar with FlourishDx, essentially we are an end-to-end provider of psychological health and safety services. What we do is we combine consulting, education, and our FlourishDx technology platform together to help our clients achieve their goal of reducing psychological injuries and improving the conditions to assist workers to thrive. One of the ways we educate is through these webinars, which we are pretty much doing fortnightly at the moment. We have other programs like our professional practice program, and we've got a new leader program that we're doing a pre-launch on next week as well. But the other way we educate is through our podcast. So if anyone's particularly interested in the topic of psych health and safety and sexual harassment prevention, then you'll find that on the Psych Health and Safety podcast, you've got hundreds of hours of back catalogue worth of episodes to listen to with some of the leading experts from around the world who come on as our guests quite regularly. So please, take a note of that and feel free to check it out if you want more content. But look, before we get over to Joelle and the presentation that she's prepared for today, what we thought we might do is just do a quick poll to determine what level of understanding people have around the Sex Discrimination Act in Australia. I know we might have some international people on here, so might be less aware of the local legislation here in Australia. But particularly the Sex Discrimination Act. 1984, Joelle? Seems about right.
I believe so, yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so it might be that you've never heard of it, and it might be that you're confident it's meeting the new requirements, which will be coming, will already enforced, but will start being enforced by the Human Rights Commission at the end of the year. Okay, so we've got 68% participated. I'll just give you another 5 seconds or so to answer that. It'd be great to know where people's existing knowledge is. Okay, we're pretty much close to 80%, so I'll close it off now. Share the results. Okay, Joelle, it looks like people are in the right place. So there's many that are aware of it but don't know much about it. So that's, definitely going to learn a lot more about what's actually required under the Act and the new requirements. There's many that are familiar with the amendments, less that understand what their organisation needs to do. Only 4 people who are confident that their organisation is already meeting the new requirements, which is both good and bad. Good in that you guys are ahead of the curve. Bad in that maybe you're not going to learn too much on this particular webinar, but hopefully it'll reinforce what you're doing is good practice. Joelle, what do you think?
Yeah, I would imagine that this is probably fairly a fairly typical representation of the population in Australia who needs to know about this stuff.
Thanks for those really cracking insights, Joelle.
You're welcome, Jason.
All right, well, over to you for your pre-prepared presentation.
Thank you. All right, so to get us started, it's useful to understand why there was the need for the need for the change was identified. So the Sex Discrimination Act, as Jason mentioned, was published in 1984, so it's quite old. It has been through a number of amendments during that period of time, and the most recent amendment came into force in December last year. So there was a review in 2020, the Respect at Work review, that looked into, I guess, a broad range of issues relating to this. And one of the conclusions from that report was that the current approaches to preventing and responding to sexual harassment in workplaces are inadequate. The finding was that these approaches would generally focus on policies prohibiting sexual harassment and then complaint mechanisms for people to report once sexual harassment occurred. So basically a high-level document saying don't do this, and then mechanisms for people to report if it does happen, and that was largely the extent of it. So this was viewed as being largely reactive and legalistic, and that it does actually often contribute to ongoing harm to workers, albeit hopefully unintended. So where workers do report instances of sexual harassment, a lot of the time, the consequences to them of actually reporting it are worse than the sexual harassment in and of itself. So there's a significant disincentive there to reporting, just because of what you sort of have to go through afterwards. So the main conclusion there is that these approaches, which have remained largely unchanged for decades, have failed to stop rising rates of workplace sexual harassment. And so it's sort of this case of, we've got ambulances at the bottom of the cliff, but we didn't have fences at the top of the cliff to stop people from falling off. And so, any sound approach to risk management recognises that we do need to have methods in place to prevent things from happening, as well as methods in place to respond once things have happened. And so, this is well established in work health and safety law and approaches to risk management. And so I guess what the Respect at Work report was driving towards was that the Sex Discrimination Act needed to take stronger steps to ensure prevention activities were undertaken as well as response activities. So if we look at the objects of the Sex Discrimination Act, it is to give effect to aspects of the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, and to eliminate, so far as possible, discrimination on the grounds of sex, sexual orientation, gender identity, and other grounds, involving sexual harassment or harassment on the grounds of sex, and involving subjecting persons to hostile workplace environments on the ground of sex. Then also promoting recognition and acceptance within the community of the principle of equality of men and women. And finally, achieving, so far as practicable, substantive equality between men and women. So some fairly lofty objects there. And then we can see sort of through the amendments to the Act how those objects are targeted, I suppose. So there were a number of amendments to the Act. What we're going to be focusing on today is the positive duty, which is the amendment that's getting the most attention, I suppose. So what this positive duty states is that an employer or a PCBU must take reasonable and proportionate measures to eliminate, as far as possible, discrimination on the ground of sex in a work context, sexual harassment or sex-based harassment in connection with work, conduct creating a hostile workplace environment on the ground of sex, and then related acts of victimization. So this is similar to your WHS duties in that that duty is to, prevent or provide a workplace that is safe and without risk to health. And so we've got sort of this similar type of duty here, but it is really focused in on sex-based discrimination and sexual harassment. So we have looked at how the Sexual Discrimination Act compares to work health and safety laws. And so on this slide, we can see that there is actually quite a lot of common ground between the Work Health and Safety Act and regulations and the Sex Discrimination Act and the guidelines that have been published by the Human Rights Commission. So there is that overarching duty for the PCBU or the employer to prevent harm. There are requirements for leadership due diligence. There's a requirement to identify the sources of risk, to identify the workers who are more likely to be exposed to harm, to understand how different hazards and factors can combine to increase risk, to put proactive controls in place to eliminate or minimise the risk of harm, to monitor the effectiveness of controls, to consult with affected workers, to provide information, training and supervision, and then to investigate incidents when they occur. So there's quite a lot of commonality between the two sets of legislation there. So organisations can probably, where they have a mature safety management system and where they've started to look at integration of psychosocial risk management into that safety management system, can also use those systems of work to extend out to sexual discrimination and harassment as well. So if we focus in again on the sexual harassment component of this legislation, it defines sexual harassment as an unwelcome sexual advance or an unwelcome request for sexual favours or other unwelcome conduct of a sexual nature. So that's sort of the first element of it. And then the second element of it is in circumstances in which a reasonable person would have anticipated the possibility that the person harassed would be offended, humiliated or intimidated. There's sort of two elements there. And importantly here, it doesn't say anything about it being repeated. So it can just be a single instance. So different to bullying in that bullying is sort of repeated occurrences. This can just be a single occasion. So I guess the significant question here is, is sexual harassment a hazard or is it an outcome? And so I think a lot of the approach to sexual harassment has been sort of looking at it as a hazard in and of itself. But if we want to really take a fully preventative approach, we really need to understand it also as an outcome. So the point there is that it's both, really. So, it is certainly a hazard or a psychosocial hazard because it can cause psychological harm to the person being harassed and also to people witnessing the harassment in some instances. So yes, it certainly is a hazard, but it's also an outcome. And so I'll be I'll be talking through the Human Rights Commission guidelines in the coming slides. And that really sort of talks about the different risk factors that are drivers of sexual harassment in an organisation. And so those primary risk factors are gender inequality and power imbalances, and those sort of give rise to other types of risk factors as well. So we can sort of look at it in different ways there. Yes, we need to prevent that behaviour from occurring, but if we take a step back from that behaviour and actually address the risk factors, rather than just giving people training in, well, this is the behaviour and don't do it, and here's how to intervene if you see it happening, we actually look at what are the organisational drivers that enable or allow those behaviours to occur, then we don't actually need to, we still need to train people in expectations, but that becomes a less important aspect of our approach, or certainly not the only aspect of our approach. So the Australian Human Rights Commission has published guidelines. These guidelines, they've indicated, will be used once they start undertaking enforcement in December of this year. So largely the expectation from the Human Rights Commission is that organisations will use these guidelines to inform their approach to compliance with the Sex Discrimination Act. And so they've identified 7 elements that are necessary, or 7 standards rather, that organisations should follow. And these are really split into 2 groups. So there's a set of prevention standards and then a set of response standards. So we'll go through those in a little bit of detail in the coming slides. And the guidelines for complying with the positive duty under the Sex Discrimination Act was published in August of this year, and that's just freely available to download from the Australian Human Rights Commission webpage. All right, so if we look at the prevention standards, we start out with leadership. So this is really recognising the role that senior leaders in particular play in, I guess, being primarily responsible for prevention and management of sexual harassment. So it all comes back to your board and your executive in terms of, responsibility and obligation there. So leaders really are responsible for developing and maintaining cultures that do prevent workplace sexual harassment from occurring. And so feeding into that leadership is not just, I guess, the behaviours that leaders display, but also, feeding through into our other systems of work, like our, recognition and reward systems, our recruitment processes, governance structures that the board and exec are relying on to inform them about what's happening in the organisation. So there's quite a broad array of strategies and approaches that leaders should be engaging in to ensure that they are actually meeting their duty. And that aligns then or feeds into the culture standard. And so, this is really about what, if we go back to that standard definition of culture, the way we do things around here, what behaviours are actually tolerated or accepted, what behaviours are rewarded and reinforced, what behaviours are ignored. All of these sorts of things are an outcome of culture. And so, we understand that leaders have the greatest opportunity to create and drive culture. And they can do that through, again, understanding and creating appropriate systems of work within organisations. So certainly our policies and our human resources practices have a significant role to play there in setting that organisational culture. And then it sort of extends then into those informal behaviours and modes of operating. So then risk assessment and transparency. This is the standard that probably most closely feeds into the Work Health and Safety Act and regulations and our approaches to managing work health and safety. And this is really about understanding what are the risk factors or drivers, putting controls in place to address those risk factors and drivers, and then monitoring the effectiveness of those controls. So that's sort of where our risk management cycle really comes into it, and where we can use our existing systems of work for risk management to help inform us about what are the things that we need to do to actually demonstrate that we're taking all steps to prevent sexual harassment and discrimination from occurring. And then the third one is knowledge. And this is really saying, yes, there have been, policy and training have kind of been the standard approaches that organisations have taken to the prevention of sexual harassment and discrimination in the past. And what this is saying is that, knowledge is really important, and it is, having policy and having training is an important part of this overall approach. But probably the ways that these have been done historically haven't been effective. So we actually need to think about what are the types of training and what are the types of policies that are actually going to be impactful, that are going to drive the change that we need to see here. So that's prevention. And then we can move into response. And there are 3 standards there for response. So support, reporting, and measuring. So the support standard, so this is really sort of adopting trauma-informed and person-centric approaches when somebody is experiencing sexual harassment. So even before they choose to make a report, in terms of it being a formal grievance complaint, that, we should have people in the organisation who are trained in how to provide support for people to help them actually even decide what do they want to do next. Do they want to make a formal report? Do they want to deal with it in a different way? Those sorts of things. So helping them really to understand what their options are, and helping them to make an informed decision about what steps to take next, and then giving them that support throughout the process as well if they do choose to engage in a report, making sure that we do have those people who are trained in how to provide good evidence-informed support for people. The next one is reporting. So recognising that reporting systems sometimes can be quite convoluted, legalistic and complex. For somebody who's been sexually harassed, giving them a really complex reporting process to follow isn't helpful and can actually be harmful. So part of the reporting standard is to have a variety of reporting options available to help overcome any barriers to reporting. In addition to that, creating different ways for employers to intervene to address sexual harassment. So we shouldn't just be relying on a formal grievance investigation. We should have multiple approaches that we can use to address that behaviour if it's happening or if it's been reported. So thinking about other approaches outside of just that win-lose type of a investigation approach. And again, making sure that if we are conducting a formal investigation, that we are adopting a person-centred and trauma-informed approach so that we're not causing additional harm to the person reporting or the person who's been alleged to have engaged in that behaviour. And so then the final standard is measuring. So this is about the data that we're collecting to inform our approach and to also determine whether our approach is being effective or not. So this is data at the workplace and also at the industry. So there are different types of factors that are more relevant to industries that are also likely to influence sexual harassment occurrence in our organisation. So understanding what that industry level data is telling us as well as data from within our organisation. So that can help us to understand better what the nature of the problem is and the extent of the problem in our organisations. And so we really shouldn't just be relying on grievance reports because, for a range of reasons, we know that they really are the tip of the iceberg, and they tend to be the last resort for a lot of people. So once it gets to the point of somebody feeling that they need to report, that there's generally been a lot going on before it gets to that point. So what we really want our data to do is help us to understand the prevalence of sexual harassment behaviours in our organisation, the nature of those behaviours and their impacts, and then also the effectiveness of the initiatives that we have in place to address those. And so that measuring one in particular ties back to leadership, where we look at governance structures that we have in place. What are the data sources that our leadership are relying on to inform their understanding of the problem and the actions that they're taking in response to the problem?
Hi listeners, Jason here. We hope you're enjoying this latest podcast episode. Now, if you're like Joelle, Alicia and myself and enjoy learning from the best, then the FlourishDx Academy is for you. The Academy includes free e-learning courses on the ISO 45003 standard for psychological health and safety at work, and associated topics such as how to conduct a psychosocial risk assessment and how to create the business case for psych health and safety. All courses feature high-quality videos, downloadable resources, multi-choice questions, and a downloadable training certificate on completion. Take your learning to the next level with all FlourishDx Academy courses included within the FlourishDx mobile app. Select podcast episodes from the Psych Health and Safety podcast and sister podcasts from Canada and the USA are also included. Get started with FlourishDx for free at www.flourishdx.com/get-started. That's www.flourishdx.com/get-started. Now back to this episode.
There's been, I guess, a lot of a lot of commentary about this being a really significant change to the Sex Discrimination Act, this introduction of the positive duty. And it can, I guess, be overwhelming for organisations who haven't thought about this before. But if we do have those work health and safety frameworks in place already, where we understand what is a system of work that helps us to identify risk factors, put controls in place that are preventative as well as responsive, and how can we monitor the effectiveness of those, we can actually apply those frameworks to help us meet the requirements of the Sex Discrimination Act in relation to that positive duty. So you shouldn't be starting from zero. And so for those of you who are maybe in the people and culture or industrial relations space, I would encourage you to actually reach out to your work health and safety team in your organisation and actually talk through, what are these positive duty requirements? Where are there similarities or consistencies with the Work Health and Safety Act? And what can we do? Or what do we already have in place that we can leverage to help us meet our Sex Discrimination Act duties? So if you would like assistance with this, this is something that we have been doing a little bit of with clients recently. Jason mentioned that I did recently do a fairly significant scope of work with a regulator where we essentially conducted inspections of a number of duty holders in that regulator's jurisdiction to understand how well they're currently meeting the requirements of the Sex Discrimination Act following the Human Rights Commission guidelines. Other things that we're doing in this space are things like a gap analysis, so looking at what clients currently have in place and comparing that to what the guidelines are requiring, and making then sort of recommendations about roadmaps to demonstrate compliance with the guidelines. So you can reach out to us for more information about that. Further, if you're familiar with our risk assessment tool, we can also use that tool to look at interactions between hazards and things like gender, sexual orientation, those types of demographics that lead workers to be more vulnerable, age, those types of things as well. All right. So that brings us through to Q&A. Last session, we had a lot of questions, so it was good that we had a decent chunk of time available for Q&A. So I'm glad that I've been able to deliver that again today.
Yes, well done, Joelle. Concise is not one of your strengths. I kid. No.
Rude.
I know. That's just me leaning into one of my strengths. Hey, Evelyn asked the question around, can you give some other examples of other approaches for reporting other than grievance procedure? So do you have any other examples you can share?
Yeah, look, it might just be a matter of initially having a conversation with someone and saying, look, this is what's happening and I just want it to stop. And I don't actually need a formal investigation to say, yes, you're right and they're wrong. I just want this behaviour to stop. And that's the majority of the time, that's what people want. They just want the behaviour to stop. So that type of thing doesn't really need a full-fledged investigation. It's just a matter of somebody going and having a chat with whoever it is that's engaging in that behaviour and saying, this is making this person uncomfortable and we need you to stop. And then just monitoring and making sure that it has actually stopped. And if it hasn't, then, okay, well, what else can we do here? Do we need to do training? Do we need to maybe move people into a different roster or a different team, or, there are different avenues that we can explore there to help prevent that ongoing harm from occurring. So yeah, I guess the disciplinary consequence isn't the only avenue that we have there. And so largely it's about for the person who is affected by the behavior, it's really about, again, that person-centered approach is to say, well, what would you like as the outcome of this? And then really any responses that we take then are primarily focused on how can we achieve that outcome, assuming that the outcome is sort of reasonable and proportionate.
Okay, so hopefully that answers the question. Feel free to put a follow-up question in the chat if you want to go a bit further. Another question. The ACT has introduced a requirement to report sexual harassment incidents to their safe work regulator. We did have a representative from the ACT regulator on the last time we did this webinar. Have you heard if other states are planning anything similar?
I think ACT is sexual assault, not harassment. I could be wrong, but I believe that's from memory, that's what it is. So DEMAs in WA also have that requirement that the instances of sexual assault must be reported to DEMAs. But yeah, recognizing that sexual assault, I guess, involves, physical interactions as opposed to, verbal interactions, which would be much more frequently occurring. So that's the extent of my knowledge about reporting requirements at this stage. I think it's probably, that's within the Work Health and Safety Act reporting requirements. So whether the Human Rights Commission introduces reporting requirements through to themselves as the regulator for the Sex Discrimination Act, we'll just, I guess, have to wait and see whether they feel that becomes a necessary requirement.
The Victorian proposed regs, did they have something in it?
They did, yeah, they did for sexual harassment, yeah. But that was not reporting individual instances. That was providing a quarterly, here's how many reports we received.
Yeah, cool. We've got a Queenslander. I like, Joelle, how your response emphasised leaning into the person affected to see what their expectations are. That is reflective of restorative justice culture and meeting the needs of victims as the priority. Nice. Well, that's why Joelle is known as Just Joelle.
So I guess there's there are 4 principles that sort of underpin the 7 standards. And so, one of those is trauma-informed and person-centered approaches to everything in relation to this. So it is very much about recognising that strategies that have been used to date have typically caused further harm to people, and we don't want to be doing that.
Yeah, we'll be releasing some statistics actually from Safe Work Australia. Some of you would have seen that they've released their compensation summary just recently. They do show that there's been an escalation again in the median amount of time off work when people do make a claim for a psychological injury. It's now 34.2 weeks, up from about 30 weeks from the previous reporting period. What is really interesting, and I haven't seen anyone else unpack this yet, and so I'll be putting out some information in our next EDM that will go out on Tuesday. If you're coming along to this session, no doubt you're subscribed to it. But that will show that even though psychological injuries only account for 9.2% of all serious injury claims made in the last year, they actually account for 39.1% of the time lost due to all illnesses and injuries. So it's a huge proportion of the bucket. So to Joelle's point, we need to make sure that we don't do any further harm when people do have a psychological injury, whether it's due to sexual harassment, a sexual assault, bullying harassment, work overload, any of these things. We really need to be mindful of what can we do to do no further harm and make sure that we don't end up with a huge amount of time off work due to the psychological injury that has been worsened due to the investigation. All right, another question here. Often the person accused of the behaviour denies that it is happening, and I'm conscious as well of the procedural fairness for the perpetrator. Do you think it would move to formal investigation if the perpetrator denies?
Not necessarily. So again, it depends on what is it that the person reporting actually wants to achieve. So if we take it away from the win-lose situation where, it's either you've been engaging in that behaviour and you're going to have a disciplinary action made against you, if we can actually move away from that type of punitive approach and is actually about saying, well, this is the experience that this person is having as a consequence of these things that you have been apparently saying or doing or whatever that might be. we don't necessarily need that person to say, yes, I've been doing that. It can be a matter of saying, please don't engage in these behaviors, whether or not you've been aware of doing those, doing that previously or whatever that might be. I think if we can get out of that punitive mindset, then giving people that guidance or instruction or correction and saying, hey, please don't do this. In some cases, that can be enough. So, yeah, if there's not the implication of a disciplinary outcome, then there may be less the need for somebody to say, yes, I did, or no, I didn't, becomes less important because it's just a matter of saying, here's what we need to see happen moving forward. So we can sort of get out of that legalistic approach to did it happen or not, and actually look at, well, what's the solution that we want to achieve, and how do we land on that solution instead?
Okay, the questions are flying in thick and fast now. So given there is overlap, what are the options, avenues for workers or PCBU to pursue a sexual harassment issue via WHS laws as opposed to sexual discrimination laws or even labour laws?
Are you through your employer or through a regulator? I think you can report either way to the regulator if you want to. I think from a WHS perspective, I can't speak to what the Human Rights Commission will do because they haven't actually started their enforcement activities yet. Speaking from the perspective of a WHS regulator, what they will be likely to do is to first look to what has your organisation done about this. Does your organisation have appropriate systems of work in place to be able to manage this? So that's really going to be the first thing that a WHS regulator looks to, rather than saying, did this happen or did it not happen? I think that predominantly it will be, what are the systems of work in place in that organisation? Were those systems of work effective in this particular situation? And if not, then what do we need to do about it? So your initial step should generally be to raise it with your organisation. I think you can also take it to Fair Work Australia as well, and request things like a stop bullying order or similar for harassment.
Yeah, hopefully that helps clear up that question. We've got a question from a friend from across the ditch. At a conference last year in Brisbane, I heard a lawyer say that health and safety teams will need to be involved in reviewing all HR performance complaints in the future to ensure that potential systemic issues drivers of psych health and safety risk are identified. So moving it from a focus on the individual to a focus on the system. Would you see that happening in relation to sexual harassment too? So, such as, should the health and safety team always be part of any sexual harassment investigation?
Yeah, look, I think that's useful. And what we've seen happening currently is that HR will do their investigation first, and then if the claims are substantiated, then they'll bring the health and safety team in to then do a second investigation. And so from a trauma-informed perspective, that's really poor practice, because we're asking the person who's been harassed to go through two whole separate investigations, often recounting the same information, being asked the same questions, that sort of thing. So from that person-centered and trauma-informed approach, ideally we should just be doing the one investigation where an investigation is necessary, and having, both parties there. So having the HR and having the work health and safety representatives both involved in that investigation, so that we're able to collect all of the information that we need through that one single process.
Yeah, that's wise. And that's the big thing, right? We know that the more people have to sit there and recount the same issue over and over again, the more potential further trauma can be caused. So, that's good practice, obviously. Be interesting to see how companies adapt, I guess, and mature in their approaches. Okay, next question. How do organisations determine when it is necessary to disregard a person's explicit request not to investigate a reported case of sexual harassment, especially when assessing the seriousness of the incident?
Yeah, this is this is definitely a challenge for most organisations that I've spoken with. How do they balance the need to protect the complainant and act in the complainant's best interests, and how do they balance that with the potential ongoing risk to other workers posed by somebody in that workplace? I don't think that there's an easy answer to that, and I think that it is on a case-by-case basis. Certainly what some organisations are doing is proceeding with an investigation without requiring the complainant to participate in that investigation. So they can do things like speaking with people who may have been witnesses, speaking with people who may also have experienced similar behaviour from that person, that sort of thing. So I guess they're looking for ways to still carry out an investigation without requiring the participation of the person who initially raised the concerns. But I think, it's about looking at what's the seriousness of that situation in question. What's the likelihood that other people will be at risk in that situation if it isn't investigated, if it isn't followed up, and sort of balancing it out. But it is going to necessarily be on a case-by-case basis.
Okay, thank you for that. And feel free to ask any follow-up questions on that one. So another question, picking up on previous comments, punishment for perpetrators is a typical organisational response to incidences of sexual harassment. What might a more enlightened second victim approach look like? Or what have you seen as good practice in this regard?
Yeah, so again, I think it's about saying, whether or not you believe that you've engaged in these behaviours, we want to reiterate that these behaviours are inappropriate, and here's what we need to see moving forward. So we can kind of just circumvent that whole did you do it, didn't you do it thing, and just say, here's what we need to see moving forward, and can we agree to that moving forward? So getting out of that sort of that legalistic perspective. I think that's largely the reasonable response to take moving forward. And what that separates out is the people who are doing this with intent and the people who aren't. And the people who aren't doing it with intent, if they can see that there's no threat to their ongoing employment and they can see that it's a basic change in their behaviour, we would hope that they would be able to stop engaging in that behaviour and would be okay to do so. Where people are doing it intentionally, for reasons of power or whatever that might be, then again, we sort of start to then, when we can find the differences in those cases, then for people who are very resistant to making that change, that's sort of when we can move into more disciplinary-based approaches.
Yeah, I think that's good advice. Jovan, one of our professional practice members, has asked, sexual harassment occurring outside of work hours activity can still be considered harassment under the Act?
Yes. Yes, it can.
Yeah.
If you have a working relationship with that person, then yes.
Yeah. Okay. Hey, we're through the questions. One of the questions that came up, I thought, which was interesting last time, was the reasonable person test. So in the Act, I'll bring up the actual text. So what is sexual harassment? And it says, in circumstances where a reasonable person would have anticipated the possibility that the person harassed would be offended, humiliated, or intimidated. First of all, what does a reasonable person look like?
I think reasonable people can look like all kinds of things, Jason.
Yes. So how do we pass that test or use that test, that litmus test?
Yeah, look, the reasonable person test is always a bit of a funny one. What does that look like in reality? Again, I think it's probably going to bear out over the course of time. I would expect that the Human Rights Commission will do things like publishing case studies and examples where they will be able to give examples of the reasonable person test. It is a bit of a funny one, and it's always a little bit contentious. So I think it's probably a watch this space type of question at this stage.
Okay. Yeah, it'll be good to see some case studies, like you say, like Comcare released recently regarding how they're enforcing the new psychosocial risk regulations. Looks like we've got a couple of questions. So another one here, how do organisations determine when it is necessary to disregard a person's explicit request not to investigate a reported case of sexual harassment, especially when assessing the seriousness of the incident?
I think I already answered that one.
Oh, okay, sorry. There was someone that added a follow-up question, sorry. To add to this, if we're taking a person-centred trauma-informed approach and stop investigating the incident, then how do we meet workplace health and safety obligations?
Yeah, so again, investigation isn't the same as action. So we can take action on something to prevent it from happening again without needing to go through a legalistic investigation to determine whether allegations are substantiated or not. So we don't actually have to do that inspection or investigation to be able to stop the actions from occurring in the future. And from a WHS perspective, what that act is concerned with is stopping the behaviour from happening and stopping the harm associated with the behaviour from happening. So if we can demonstrate that that's happened, then we don't actually need to have done an investigation. From a allegations perspective, it's still, I think, useful to investigate from a work health and safety perspective, looking at what were the risk factors that were present that maybe allowed this behaviour to happen. So less about who's to blame or not to blame, but more about what were the conditions behind this particular situation or series of situations, and do we need to do something to address those enablers, if present.
Okay, well, Joelle, I think you have gotten through all the questions again. Oh, no, our friend from across the ditch has dropped in one last one. So given that some interventions to reduce risk of sexual harassment improve workplace culture, paradoxically make things worse, what advice can you give to health and safety teams to ensure that their interventions are grounded in solid evidence?
Yeah, so I think take it away from the person, take it away from applying disciplinary consequences to an individual, especially from a work health and safety perspective. Understand what are the risk factors that contribute to sexual harassment occurrences in your workplace. Focus your interventions on those risk factors rather than focusing them on individuals.
Yeah, all good advice, and I think Chris would understand that. Yeah, so Joelle, you've answered all the questions really well. Obviously, we are both on LinkedIn quite a bit, so if anyone has any follow-up questions, then feel free to reach out to either us over LinkedIn for follow-up. We are finding that, like many of the clients that we're working with now, they're looking at how do they combine what they're doing around the psychosocial risk requirements with the requirements under the Sexual Discrimination Act. So that is something that we're doing a lot more of. So if there's, if this is a point where you need some assistance or guidance, then we do offer consulting support. And as Joelle mentioned, in our standard risk assessment approach for psychosocial hazards, we also can do cover the respect at work requirements around consultation around some of the precursors to sexual harassment for the purpose of prevention. Another thing, just as a quick shout out, I know that we've got some participants from our professional practice program on this call today. So great that they're so interested with this topic that they can't get enough. So we will be running the second cohort of our professional practice program, which is our flagship program for health and safety and HR practitioners who are looking to get some practical experience going through the risk management process for psychosocial risk. So it's a 12-week program. There's 4 live lectures, 3 communities of practice. There's practical activities to take it away from just the theory, which we cover often on these webinars, to actually get you comfortable and feeling competent in your ability to go through a risk assessment, risk management process for psychosocial risks that aligns to both international best practice as well as local regulations. So still a little bit of time to go before the super early bird offer finishes, which is 30th of November. The cohort itself commences 14th of February. We will more than likely be doing a pre-launch webinar for cohort 2, where we'll get some people like Jovan on board to discuss their experience of the first cohort, to give you a bit more information about what it's all about and whether it's worthwhile investing your time and training budget into. But that brings us to the end of this webinar. So thanks everyone for your participation, your thoughtful questions. And again, feel free, if you would like to ask anything in follow-up, to either shoot through an email or hit us up on LinkedIn. We will be attempting to circulate the slides and the video within the next day or two following the recording. And it'll also go out in our EDM that will come out on Tuesday via email or LinkedIn newsletter on Wednesday. But thanks again, everyone. And we look forward to seeing you next time.
Thanks, everyone.
You've been listening to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast. To stay up to date with the latest on psychological injury prevention, follow FlourishDx on LinkedIn and subscribe to the Psych Health and Safety Podcast at www.psychealthandsafety.com.